Unauthorized structure. Remove within 30 days. Those were the first words I read on the bright orange notice nailed to my greenhouse door. My landlord wanted it gone, but what he didn't know was that removing that greenhouse might destroy something that had been hidden beneath it for decades. Travis Bennett stepped out of his pickup truck and walked across the gravel driveway. "I've already called someone to take it down," he said. No anger, no argument, just a decision that had already been made. 30 days, he added. After that, it's gone. I looked at the greenhouse behind me. To him, it was old glass, rusted metal, and a structure that no longer belonged there. But to me, it was something I had spent years protecting, and there was one reason I couldn't simply build another one somewhere else. Something inside those walls was older than anyone realized. I folded the notice carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket. I didn't tell Travis what I had found, because honestly, I wasn't completely sure myself. I walked through the greenhouse door and into the warm, familiar air. For years, I had cared for every planting bed inside. I knew which boards creaked, which windows leaked during storms, and which plants returned every spring. But there was one corner I had always ignored, the oldest bed near the back wall. That morning, something caught my attention. Several thick roots had pushed through the dark soil beside an old clay watering pot. They weren't growing like normal roots. They were twisted tightly around each other, almost like they were protecting something buried underneath. I dropped to my knees and brushed the dirt away slowly. The soil moved. My fingers touched something hard. Not a stone, not a piece of wood, something hidden. I didn't pull the object out. Not yet. Years of gardening had taught me one simple lesson. Sometimes the quickest way to destroy something valuable is to uncover it too fast. I brushed a little more soil away until the shape became clearer. It wasn't metal. It wasn't stone. The surface felt smooth, almost like baked clay. One edge disappeared beneath the thick roots, which wrapped around it so tightly they looked as though they'd been growing together for years, maybe decades. A truck door slammed outside. I looked through the greenhouse glass just as Travis spoke to two men climbing out of a white work van. "The greenhouse is the only thing coming down," he said. "Leave everything else alone." One of the workers glanced toward me before measuring the length of the greenhouse with a tape. Seeing them plan its removal made my stomach tighten. If those roots were connected to whatever lay beneath them, heavy equipment could destroy it before anyone even knew it existed. After the workers left, I returned to the back corner and carefully lifted the old clay watering pot that had been sitting there for as long as I could remember. Beneath it, I noticed something I'd never seen before. A small clay marker, no bigger than my hand, stood half buried beside the roots. Most garden markers simply carried the name of a plant. This one didn't. Its surface had almost faded away, but a single symbol was still visible. A tiny hand-carved oak leaf. Not a word, not a number, just that mark. I searched every other planting bed inside the greenhouse. Nothing. Only this one carried the strange symbol. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Somewhere in this greenhouse, someone had hidden a story. And for the first time, I wasn't sure the roots were protecting a plant. I began to wonder if they were protecting the truth itself. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twisted roots wrapped tightly around the piece of clay hidden beneath them. By sunrise, I knew I needed answers before anyone else started tearing the greenhouse apart. The farmhouse had belonged to the same family for nearly 70 years before I rented it. The previous owner, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, had lived there until she passed away. Everyone in town remembered her for two things: her greenhouse and the vegetables she refused to sell. People always assumed she was simply stubborn. Standing in my kitchen that morning, I began to wonder if there had been another reason. There was one place I hadn't looked: the attic. It hadn't been opened in years. Dust covered every wooden beam, and old boxes were stacked beneath the sloping roof. Most held faded Christmas decorations, broken picture frames, and yellowed newspapers. Then I found a small cedar chest tucked against the far wall. Inside were several worn gardening notebooks tied together with a faded green ribbon. The first pages looked ordinary. Planting dates, rainfall, frost warnings. But halfway through the oldest notebook, the handwriting changed. One sentence had been underlined twice. "Never disturb the northern bed unless the roots begin to rise." My heart skipped. The northern bed! That was exactly where I'd found the strange roots. I turned the page. The next entry didn't explain why. Instead, it ended with another warning. Some things survive only because they've been forgotten. There were no diagrams, no photographs, no mention of what lay beneath the greenhouse. Only those 2 sentences. I closed the notebook and looked toward the greenhouse through my kitchen window. For years, I'd believed I was caring for someone else's garden. Now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been trusting me to protect a secret they never had the chance to explain. By noon, I was certain someone would finally explain the roots. Instead, I left with even more questions. I carried a small root cutting to the county horticulture office, taking only a loose piece that had already separated from the edge of the bed. Whatever was growing beneath my greenhouse, I wasn't willing to damage it just to satisfy my curiosity. The specialist behind the counter barely glanced at the sample. He didn't reach for a magnifying glass. He didn't compare it with a single reference book. He simply turned it over once in his hand. "Old medicinal root," he said. "Probably nothing special." I told him about the twisted roots, the clay marker, and Eleanor Whitmore's notebook. His expression never changed. People find mysteries when they go looking for them. That was it. Years of protecting that greenhouse, dismissed in less time than it takes to finish a cup of coffee. When I turned onto my gravel driveway, I knew something had changed before I even stopped the truck. Bright orange survey flags fluttered in the afternoon breeze, surrounding the greenhouse like warning signs. Beside them, neat stacks of lumber and steel stakes waited in silence. The demolition crew wasn't waiting for 30 days anymore. They were getting ready now. A cold knot settled in my stomach. If they began digging before I learned what those roots were protecting, whatever had survived beneath that greenhouse for decades could disappear in a single afternoon. I hurried inside. My eyes went straight to the northern planting bed. Tiny bronze-colored shoots had emerged between the twisted roots overnight, their unusual color standing out against the rich black soil. As I knelt beside them, Eleanor's notebook slipped from under my arm. A folded page drifted onto the dirt. Across the top, written in faded ink, were 5 words: "If the bronze leaves appear." My hands trembled as I unfolded the brittle page. The sentence was complete. "If the bronze leaves appear, do not let anyone remove the northern bed." I read it again, then a third time. For nearly 50 years, someone had expected this moment. Suddenly, the greenhouse wasn't just a place I cared about. It had become a responsibility someone else had quietly passed on. Beneath the warning was a date, September 18th, 1974. And below that, one final instruction: call the Historical Society before anyone else. Not the county, not a university, the Historical Society. Outside, the sound of hammers echoed across the property. The demolition crew wasn't working on the greenhouse yet, but they were getting closer. Every passing hour felt like one less chance to understand what Eleanor had been trying to protect. I searched through the remaining notebooks, hoping she'd left one final explanation. Most contained nothing more than years of ordinary gardening records. Then a folded newspaper clipping slipped onto the table. Its edges had almost crumbled away with age. Only part of the headline remained: "Last known medicinal garden." The rest had faded beyond reading. I looked back at the oak leaf symbol, the warning, the bronze shoots, the clipping. For the first time, they no longer felt like separate clues. They felt like pieces of the same forgotten story. Just then, the deep rumble of a diesel engine rolled across the driveway. I hurried to the greenhouse window. A flatbed truck had pulled through the gate. Workers began unloading orange safety fencing around the greenhouse, while another man unrolled a site map across the hood of his truck. No one was looking beneath the soil. They were only looking at the building. And that frightened me even more, because they had no idea what they were about to destroy. I didn't call the county again. They had already made their decision. To them, my greenhouse was just an old structure that needed to be removed. So I called the only person Eleanor had trusted enough to leave a warning behind: the Oak Ridge Historical Society. An older woman answered after the second ring. "My name is Margaret Ellis," I said. "I found a clay marker inside an old greenhouse, and there's an oak leaf carved into it." The silence on the other end lasted longer than I expected. Then her voice changed. "Where exactly did you find it?" I told her. For a moment, she said nothing. Then came the words I wasn't expecting: "Do not move anything." My grip tightened around the phone. Why? But she was already answering. "Because if it's the symbol I think it is, that greenhouse may be protecting something nobody has seen in decades." She arrived less than an hour later. An aging station wagon rolled into the driveway, stopping beside the orange survey flags that now surrounded the greenhouse. The woman who stepped out introduced herself as Helen Carter. For more than 30 years, she had documented forgotten homesteads, family gardens, and pieces of local history that most people had stopped looking for. But the moment she entered the greenhouse, she stopped. Her eyes locked onto the clay marker. She didn't touch it. She didn't even step closer. She simply stared. "I never thought I'd see this symbol again," she whispered. From her bag, she removed a worn research binder filled with old photographs and handwritten sketches. After several minutes of comparing the pages, her expression changed. The carving matched. Exactly! Helen looked toward the northern bed. "Do you know what this means?" I slowly shook my head. She lowered her voice. "Families use this symbol to mark protected medicinal gardens." My heart sank. So Eleanor wasn't protecting the plants? Helen looked at the twisted roots beneath the soil. No. A long silence followed. She was protecting what was growing with them. Before I could ask another question, the ground outside suddenly trembled. Through the greenhouse glass, a yellow excavator rolled through the gate. Helen watched it approach. Then she looked back at the roots. "Now we find out if we're already too late." The excavator never reached the greenhouse. Before the machine moved another foot, Helen stepped outside and raised her hand. "Stop!" The operator looked confused. "We have permission to remove this structure," he said. Helen didn't argue. She simply held up Eleanor's notebook, the clay marker sketch, and the photographs from her research binder. "Not until someone confirms what is growing beneath it." For the first time, the workers looked uncertain. Within hours, the greenhouse that everyone believed was just an old building became the center of attention. A specialist from the State Botanical Archive arrived that afternoon after Helen sent photographs of the roots. He didn't walk in like the first expert. He didn't dismiss them. He didn't make assumptions. He carefully examined the bronze-colored leaves, the unusual root pattern, and the symbol carved into the clay marker. Then he looked toward Helen. "Where did you say this greenhouse was located?" She gave him the address. His expression changed because he recognized it. After several hours of examination, the answer finally came. The roots belonged to a rare medicinal plant variety that had nearly disappeared from the region decades earlier. A variety once cultivated by early farming families who preserved traditional remedies before modern medicine replaced them. The greenhouse hadn't been hiding a dangerous problem. It had been protecting a living piece of history. The specialist carefully explained that the plant survived because Eleanor had unknowingly maintained the exact conditions it needed for decades. The shade, the soil, the old planting methods, everything. By sunset, the demolition order was officially suspended. Travis Bennett stood near his pickup truck, staring at the greenhouse he had wanted removed only days earlier. "I thought it was just old glass," he said quietly. Helen looked at the greenhouse. "That's what happens when people only see what something looks like." Travis didn't respond. For the first time since this began, he wasn't looking at the structure as a problem. He was looking at it as something that had been waiting to be understood. And inside those weathered glass walls, the roots that everyone ignored had finally proven why they were worth protecting. The decision came 3 days later. The removal order was officially canceled. The greenhouse would remain standing. Not because it was old, not because it was beautiful, but because what grew beneath its soil was something the entire county had almost forgotten existed. Over the following weeks, specialists carefully documented the rare medicinal roots and the environment that had allowed them to survive for so many decades. The greenhouse was no longer considered an abandoned structure. It became a protected agricultural landmark. People who had once driven past without noticing it began stopping along the gravel road just to see the place everyone had almost lost. Some came because they were curious about the rare plants. Others came because they wanted to understand how something so valuable had survived unnoticed for so long. But for me, it was never really about the roots. It was about Eleanor, a woman I had never met, who had spent years caring for that greenhouse without knowing whether anyone would ever understand why it mattered. She didn't leave behind a sign. She didn't leave behind a letter explaining everything. She simply kept protecting the same small corner of land because, somewhere deep down, she knew it was worth preserving. A month later, Travis returned. He stood outside the greenhouse for a long time before finally speaking. "I was wrong." It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no excuse, just 2 simple words from someone who had finally learned to look closer. I nodded, because sometimes the biggest changes don't come from winning a fight. They come when someone finally understands what they almost destroyed. That spring, I planted new seeds beside the northern bed. the same place where the strange roots had pushed through the soil, the same place everyone had wanted removed. And every morning when I opened the greenhouse door, I remembered something Eleanor had unknowingly taught me. Some things are valuable, not because people notice them, but because someone cared enough to protect them before anyone else knew their worth.